Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Greenfield, and I'm the Associate Artistic Director at Playwrights Horizons, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's Lighthouse talk. Um, I suppose that this digital conversation marks the official pre-launch of our new Lighthouse project. The Lighthouse is named after its reliable guidance through dark and stormy times. And the Lighthouse Project is designed to use our spaces in new and surprising ways. And it's meant to ask us to see the event of theater and the physical object of a theater and the writing of theater and our engagement with theater through a constantly renewed lens. This coming Tuesday on January 19th, midday, we begin our Lighthouse programming with a public art installation series. The first piece of which has been created by subway and street artist Jilly Ballistic, and it'll be presented on the front of our building and effectively reactivating our theater, which has sat dark, unfortunately, since March 12th. Playwrights Horizons is grateful that we have a theater. It's a building that's become a home for us and for the work that we all believe in. But at the same time, we acknowledge that our building, our theater, is located on the island of Manhattan. It's situated on land that is Lenape-Hoking, homeland of the Lenape. Playwrights Horizons pays respect to the Lenape peoples, Lenape elders, and their ancestors past, present, and future. Also, as our theater's work and community extends beyond this island, we acknowledge that the Northeast is the homeland of many Indigenous nations. Playwrights Horizons pays respect to all Indigenous peoples who have stewarded this land throughout the generations and to their ongoing contributions culturally, intellectually, artistically, and spiritually. You may be wondering, why is a theater launching a public art series? And if you are, that's a really good point, and it needs attention, which is why we've assembled tonight's conversation, which begins with a question that I think is important for us to ask every once in a while, especially in times of crisis and of uncertainty. Why theater? What is theater for? What is theater here to do? To lead this conversation, I'm wildly happy to introduce our new Associate Artistic Director, Natasha Sinha, who's just joining us this week. This is her fourth day on staff at Playwrights Horizons, and to say that we are delighted would be a massive understatement. We are dancing in our Zoom squares as we welcome Natasha. Natasha is a producer and a dramaturg, having joined us from her recent position as Director of Artistic Programs at the Signature Theater. Prior to this, she was Associate Artistic Director at LCT3 at Lincoln Center and Associate Producer at Barrington Stage Company. She's co-founder of Beehive Dramaturgy Studio, and she's on the advisory boards of Space at Writer Farm, the Rhinebeck Writers Retreat, and Musical Theater Factory. She's the recipient of the 2019 LPTW Lucille Lortel Award. And in her free time, though it's hard to believe that she has any, Natasha is a coordinator of Amplifying Activists Together. And I'm honored to hand the conversation over to you, Natasha, and your excellent panel.
Hi, Adam. Thank you so much for that lovely intro. How dare you embarrass me with such nice things right before I come on. I'm so thrilled to be here today virtually with this particular group of brilliant theater artists, Michael John Garcés, Michael R. Jackson, Mimi Lien, and Heather Raffo. So brilliant theater artists, please turn on your videos and join me here on screen as I give a little intro about who you are. And there's so much more to say about these folks, so I encourage you all to look them up later. They're fascinating human beings. Michael John Garcés is the current artistic director of Cornerstone Theater Company, a community-engaged ensemble based in LA, where he has also written and directed many projects. Michael R. Jackson is a writer you probably know from his 2020 Pulitzer Prize-winning musical A Strange Loop, which received its world premiere at Playwrights Horizons last year. Mimi Lien is an MacArthur Genius Fellow, the first set designer ever with that distinction. She designs sets and environments for theater, dance, and opera, coming from a background in architecture. She's also a co-founder of the performance space Jack. Heather Raffo is a playwright and actress whose work often centers Middle Eastern women within refugee and immigrant communities. Heather's play Nura was produced at Playwrights Horizons, and you may also know her other play, Nine Parts of Desire, a story about 9 Iraqi women during the 2 Iraq wars. These are truly some of the most insightful artists we could be in conversation with about this question. So we're here on the eve of launching a new visual art series at our theater to prompt questions, foster dialogue, communicate an array of experiences. And appropriately tonight, we're going to talk about why theater exists in the first place. What is theater's role in society for artists and audiences? Why do we have buildings that house theater companies and theater productions? What is theater for, both the art form and the physical venue? We can go back and talk about what it did in, ancient China, India, and passion plays in ancient Egypt. We could talk about Athens and Brecht and what it's doing now in America. But I'd love to start with what theater may do for you, for the folks here on the Zoom with me. We only have an hour or so this is a big question, and it's really just to get us all thinking about how theater offers exploration and experimentation and envisioning. Um, so as a generative artist, why lean into theater specifically? Heather, you and I have talked a lot about empathy and how it functions in theater. What does theater offer you in your desire to tell the stories that you want to tell?
I'm shy to go first, but I'll dive in. Um, I feel like my lens is really small for that, to answer that question, in that I cannot separate my Iraqi Americanness from answering that question. In 2003, when I was a budding theater artist who had already chosen theater, but how to answer the question of why theater, there was literally nowhere else one could go. There wasn't a film, there wasn't TV, there wasn't honest conversation. Remember what happened to the Dixie Chicks? Like, I don't know if you guys can you remember the time where you couldn't say anything? And then in the theater, you also couldn't really say anything. So I couldn't get a workshop. I couldn't even read the play in the American theater. It was dangerous. It was dangerous material, both for the theater, for a person who's Iraqi or American. So the fact that I had to really look at the landscape and say, am I going to be an activist or am I going to be an artist? And what's the trade-off between the two? And I really felt that activism was a viable route, but that there was a sacred space that you could create in theater for a kind of conversation that was impossible to have in America at that time, uniquely in the theater and nowhere else. And then I got maybe 2 theaters to say they do it, right? So the whole thing was a miracle of why theater in the first place. But then once the conversation happened, it was like a snowball effect. It kept happening. And people from all walks of life wanted to have that conversation. So I think that, it blows my mind, the people from different communities that came together. And so I think that moment really renewed my faith in the power of theater, even though I came to it like I don't have any other place to go.
Right, right. And for Michael, I'm curious, as another writer on this panel, you funneled insight that we can see in other places too, your social media even, but you put this into a Strange Loop, a musical that many of us saw at Playwrights Horizons and were so moved by. It just unapologetically tells its story. There's such piercing honesty and like true entertainment as well. um, some of my favorite songs. But why use theater for all that you're curious about? Why do you funnel it into theater? Why create for the stage? You're on mute, Michael.
I think because it's live and in person, it's real people, it's real actual human energy in an exchange going back and forth from the audience to the stage. And if you're able to tell you know, the story that you want to tell, and pack all that sort of like voltage into it, and then send that voltage out, and then it gets amplified and sent back, and there's like a conversation. It's, you know, a lot of people, you know, say theater is church. I mean, but that's what happens when you're in that kind of back and forth, like performer, you know, or story audience construction. Like it's just all about energy exchange, and I just think that can change you, and I find that to be thrilling. And you know, I got to New York in 1999 as like an 18-year-old to study playwriting, and I didn't know anything about playwriting. I didn't know anything about the world. Like I had no real point of view on the world whatsoever. And I remember going to see, I told the story a million times to other people, but like, I remember going to see Death of the Salesman, which is like, you know, at this point, the most basic American play or whatever. But at that time, it was not, I'd never seen like a serious Broadway play. And like, as a 19-year-old, I sat and I watched the story of this man named Willie Loman, and I was moved. And I couldn't, in the moment, tell you why, but I felt something electric happening in this telling of that person's story that inspired me to want to try to write. And I mean, that was one of many things I saw that did that, but it was like, I was like, that was like where I caught the bug. It was like, oh, like I want to do that. And for me, like there's nothing else like that.
Yeah, I think there's so much about the energy exchange among everyone who's actually in that physical space. Heather, I feel like when you're talking about, you know, being able to bring your stories to life finally, and Michael, I remember being in the room when A Strange Loop was in previews and then like on opening night, and just like the different audiences and how people engaged with it and had different experiences and took different things from it, because of how specific the story was, and how your lens was trying to get at something while also allowing everyone to sort of bring their own perspectives and experiences to it. I don't know if you
Yeah.
want to talk about that more.
Yeah, so something that I sort of discovered, this is something I discovered as a result of going to the show after it opened, and like, and meeting audience members after the show, was the thing that really clicked into place for me, which I was really thrilled and excited about. And like, frankly, is now, I think, how I want to approach everything that I write, which was that for that show, for some people, it was a mirror. And for other people, it was a window. And the people in the audience could come to meet the show wherever they were. Like, it wasn't like, I wasn't trying to like beat anybody over the head with anything. It was just like, here's like an experience in a dramatic situation and music and story and song and all that. And wherever you are in the world, you come and you get to decide for yourself, like how you feel about it. And like, for some people, it just was like, oh, I'm a fat Black gay man and I feel seen. Or maybe I'm not even a fat Black gay man. Maybe I'm just like a gay man, or like whatever. Like, there's some aspect of it that feels like that mirrors my experience. And then like, I would have like little old ladies from the Upper West Side come and be like, I'm not a fat Black gay man and I feel like I learned something, or I'm so moved. It's about being alive, or, you know, whatever it was. And I love that like those two people could, like, who have nothing at all to do with one another on a given basis, decided to buy a ticket and come see the show that was about this like Black gay man, you know, struggle for self-acceptance, and they were able to take something from it for themselves, you know. And I find that which is exactly what I felt when I went to go watch Death of the Salesman. And so it's just thrilling to me, you know, just to be able to be a part of a form that's the nature of what you do.
Yeah, can I jump in? I really want to respond to that because I feel like so excited by what you're saying. That energy, to me, as someone who's like obsessed with space, is really about the undeniability of three-dimensional space in a way. I'm like, we have these three-dimensional bodies and we move around in three-dimensional space. And so like of all of the art forms, theater, because we experience it, you know, at least in theater in its pre-virtual existence, live theater, we experience it with our bodies. And so it's like, it's the most effective way to bridge a hypothetical situation or a story with the real experience that you're having with your body, you know?
Right.
Absolutely. And I love that what you said, Michael, about for some it's a mirror and for some it's a window. That feels so real. And that makes me wonder, you know, is theater's purpose different for one community versus another? And how is it sort of pointed in that way? What happens when the audience is comprised of lots of different kinds of people? And how does the responsibility shift? And I wonder, I mean, I feel like all of you have worked on pieces that are really highlighting something, you know, really trying to highlight something that's happening in the world underlying what we might see. And so I think that speaks to which communities might be affected differently. And I'm curious to hear more about how you approach that.
I would say, when we talk about what theater's for, and I like to do. We do a lot of work in at Cornerstone in community context. So sometimes they might be in a building that we call a theater, but often enough they're not, right? And so, what is that forum for? What is the forum for? And thinking about your question, I mean, I think in different contexts, we talk a lot about the difference between shows that are or individuals or groups that respond to the show as a kind of bonding experience, as they bond with the performers, they bond with each other. It helps it creates a sense of communal experience versus a project that might bridge across difference, right? And so I think as theaters, people who run theaters, people who make theater as organizationally or as creating a forum, it's in a way you want to take responsibility to think about what you're doing and being and be in active relationship with the people who are seeing the show, so you understand what you might be doing, right, and not assuming that it's one or the other or something else entirely, right? And on sort of a deeper level, I think about we talk a lot about theater being a place to sort of experience or exercise compassion, empathy, and as theater artists, we're kind of little empathy machines, right? Like actors, what they do is they empathize, right? It's sort of what they're built to do, right? And I think writers and directors, et cetera. And we, I think as human beings are built to empathize, right? To find what is like in something else and then bond with that and then, and say, okay, there's the commonality. And I think the really interesting work of theater is when we can sort of go beyond that to compassion and sort of start to not only see but bond with and appreciate what is different in the other. Do you know what I mean? That's the harder work, but I think ultimately the work I'm most interested in is when we can actually break through and create opportunities for compassion.
Absolutely. Heather, I feel like I think about this question of empathy so much when we were talking about your play recently, and what role that plays in, the writing of and the reception of a piece. And it's really interesting to think about theater, as a building that has people streaming in and out of it and colliding with one another and colliding with what this story is. And your stories, I feel like, are ones that we don't see enough on stage in the way that you write them. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about, why use theater in this way to sort of give empathy an engine, but also use it very specifically so that we're actually, respecting the person themselves rather than just the idea or like the person as a victim or a person where a power dynamic still gets to stay in place, and it sort of perpetuates the way that they exist in the real world. I don't know if you want to talk more about that.
Yeah, no, I'll jump on what Michael was saying is that, I mean, we all know the value of empathy to society, right? But as a goal for the American theater, it's too flat and it's too often brought up as the reason we do theater. And then if people have empathized with the characters, they get to walk away and have their drink and think they did a good job. And they did, to some extent. Like they did open-heartedly enter church and go, wow, and felt all the things and carried them for that moment. But it's just not the answer. It's just not good enough. And I'm not saying that everybody has to walk out an activist either. I'm reflecting as an artist that I feel like empathy keeps me in service, right? So if I'm writing about Middle Eastern peoples or women or refugees, it's as if my characters aren't sympathetic, then they don't have value. Right. And so I'm really in this push-pull between what is empathy and what is value. And I'd like to reframe the goal is value, not empathy. Like I don't want to be in the position where I have to write empathetic characters. I'm tired of that already. Right. I want to be in the position of doing an art action and having, I loved what you said, Michael. To some it's a mirror and some it's a window. I'm going to steal that and take that and write that on my wall. Like I needed that information today. And I thank you for that, because it's just simpler than, oh, I'm feeling all over this and then feel like I did a good job because I'm feeling, right? So yeah, I guess I'm really interested in how characters can be super difficult too, especially when they come from communities from which the audience isn't, and be valued for everything they are rather than just how they make that audience feel.
Absolutely. And Michael, you're talking about this deeper relationship that Heather's also exploring here, that you can get into in the making of and the experience of a piece. I've been thinking a lot about the piece you did about a farmers' protest, with the protests in India happening right now with farmers. I was just thinking of what you've done and how you've connected the dots there with your work. And I'm curious, what theater offers when it's actually not so much about is the audience so different from the people they're seeing on stage, which sometimes is where the conversation goes to when we're talking particularly about, pieces that center historically oppressed communities, which I think, the theater industry is trying to tackle more and more. But that often leads to a place of assuming that the audience will look very different. But I'm curious what it looks like when you're so deeply embedded in a community and what the theater can do for the entirety of that community.
Yeah, I mean, I think I certainly think one of the things we can do usefully, and sometimes when I work in Theater X, I start to feel like I'm a little crazy because you ask certain questions, critical questions, both either through the work or just you just ask them, and there's the defensiveness that comes up, the sort of either from the audience or certainly from folks in the institution, and I think as we think about the bigger and bigger critical questions and diversifying who's on stage, and diversifying the audience without sort of segregating the audience, I think we need institutions that embrace really difficult critical questions as useful challenges that provide an opportunity to break through into beauty, as opposed to as threats. And not that I don't want to threaten some people, because I do, but you know what I mean? That the institution embraces those critical questions and supports the artist in making them, so you can indeed have unsympathetic characters who have tremendous value and challenge the audience. And I think if the audience feels the institutional embrace of those questions and elevates that as a forum, then the audience, I think, will be more prone to go for the ride.
I love breaking through into beauty. That's so wonderful. Do you all have sort of examples in mind, or things that you go back to, like Michael Jackson, you were talking about Death of the Salesman as this moment that opened something up for you. Were there sort of examples that you've seen where theater can do something for the whole of a society, of a culture, ways that you can sort of track that, or that you've tried to mimic, or that you've just admired and looked up to? Since we all are doing this for a reason, we're all in theater for for this, belief that theater is powerful in some way, even though we might also address the fact that it may not entirely change the world. This is something I struggle with a lot in sort of understanding that balance. But I'm curious if there are pieces of work that maybe you worked on, experiences, processes, or works that you've seen that did some of that in a way that was really exciting and that felt like, oh, yes, this is what theater is for.
Well, for me, I mean, it's weird, it might be weird to say this. I sort of feel that about my next show that I've been working on for a while, because it's been in development for a bit, and and the development of it has continued even though we've been on hiatus. But the more, it's actually informed by quite a lot of what is happening in the world and various conversations. And some of the conclusions I've been coming to about what theater is for, and this question about the individual versus the group. I feel like I'm coming to a really exciting thesis synthesis of ideas that I'm excited to put in front of people, even though I'm also terrified to put them in front of people, because in order to get to some of the conclusions I think I'm coming to, I have to step on quite a lot of daisies that might make some people uncomfortable or feel attacked or not, or I don't know, but it's all in my mind. It's in service of something that I think is about bringing people together in theater, which feels important somehow. Despite all of the many differences that we have in the world, that the dream of coming together is actually quite important, in a way that I sort of feel might sometimes seem naive or childlike to think that, but actually feels really vitally important. And I know that might sound very vague, but that's sort of what I feel like I'm hopefully contributing toward that.
Michael, can I ask if there's something about developing it virtually right now that is particularly shaping it in a innovative, exciting, or even just inside the characters, just in a particular way that you're finding?
Yeah. So we did a couple of readings of it on Zoom, which when we first did it, I was not sure how I was going to feel about that. But the thing that ended up happening was that because it was on Zoom, I had to rely 100% more on listening. And the more I was able to listen, I could actually think more deeply about what the piece is, and is trying to be. And so I found that to be just profoundly valuable. And I think, also just because we all were trapped on these boxes online and feeling very vulnerable about listening to each other, the listening got even more amplified. And I feel like we were a lot more, just as a company of people trying to do this thing online, we were even more open than we might have been if we had been doing it in person, because the stakes were oddly higher, to do it online, and so I did full rewrites over the course of the 29 hours that we did the two workshops, and I found it really, really helpful, because it just spurred all kinds of thoughts, oppositional thoughts. I found that I was able to really underline contradictions that I want to really highlight for the audience, that it's not a piece that is about just presenting confirmation bias for a liberal audience. It's truly an attempt to look at an issue from a lot of different complex points of view, and like and give love to kind of all of them, which I feel, which is not something I've ever really done before. So I know, I feel excited about it.
Yeah, Michael, I feel like your work fuels conversation because you're not landing on one certainty most of the time. It's injecting, questions and just sort of a way to continue the thought process, which feels like something that then smashes up against, when you're experiencing that in the theater, it smashes up against the fact that you're around all these other audience members experiencing the same thing. And that's something that during this pandemic and being able to, experience something online, there's been various types of Zoom theater. But I'm curious how the energy exchange, like Mimi, when you're thinking about designing a space, or especially when it's, one of the more immersive shows that you've done where it's really experiential and it's about the audience being physically in the same space and having unpredictable things happen. How is it, like, what are you thinking about the current moment and where we are in terms of, there's many months probably without in-person productions, and telling story is so different this way. And what are we losing, and what are we excited to not return to? I'm always wary of saying return to, but to move forward into after this era.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to something you said earlier about a theater being a physical place, like a building where people like collide with each other, and I think that the thing that we're really missing without the ability to gather in or like kind of occupy the same space together is actually like maybe the possibility of disorientation, or like unexpected, like experiencing an unexpected thing, or like having something catch your attention, having your body react to something that you weren't expecting. This kind of disorientation or disruption, I feel like is something that is really, that's something that we're really missing when we're not able to kind of collide and interact with each other in real space. And I guess I'm finding myself kind of zooming out to a more macro view, like thinking about the conversation about empathy and like Heather's like refusal to keep writing like empathetic characters, like in the context of this disruption, and that perhaps that's a useful thing about theater, about theater spaces. I mean, I always think of them as, civic spaces and art spaces at the same time, right? So it really is and needs to be thought of as a civic space, like a place that is within the society, and that buildings, are a kind of manifestation of societal priorities, right? And the things that we put in those buildings. So I guess I feel like, the possibility of disruption can be a positive thing, Maybe thinking back to it. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. No, please.
Oh, I guess maybe then looping back to the specific, like perhaps a specific example that has to do with that feeling of disruption and like how, I mean, one of my favorite things to do, I mean, I love designing in flexible spaces because I love designing the relationship of the audience to the performance, because I think that changes everything, I actually, the very first, so I came from a background in architecture, and I think that it was useful to have this background of thinking about designing space, as a public space. And so the audience is kind of everyone. And, whatever you're designing can be interpreted in so many different ways by everyone who's coming to it with different experiences. But thinking about the relationship of audience to the performance, the very first thing I ever designed, which was in grad school, it was a Nigerian version of Antigone. And I remember doing all this research on, African performance, and I noticed that in the photos, it was almost always like a group of people standing around in a circle, and the performance happening within. And I'm like, that is like a completely different relationship than people sitting in chairs in rows, and I think that was my first lesson in audience performance spatial relationships. But perhaps another example of something that I worked on recently was, Fairview, where, the audience is literally asked to move from one space to another. And the significance of that, exchange of space was a real disruption, both physically and mentally and emotionally.
I think the notion of disruption and how live performance, can provide that in ways that are particularly disorienting and particularly, obviously communal, is really interesting in this moment of creating online, and how to disrupt the online space, the mediated screen space, how to disrupt Zoom essentially, is really interesting. Worked on a piece here at Cornerstone, a piece called Highland Park is Here. It was written by Mark Valdez, and it was a piece that was written from stories that we collected from members of the Los Angeles neighborhood Highland Park, which is one that is in the midst of like a lot of LA neighborhoods, but particularly intensely in the midst of sort of the demographic and social change that we often call gentrification, and it's really, it's so extreme here sometimes that it feels violent. So having to, when we conceived of the project, it was going to be, in real space, a real analog space and time, and then to have to sort of shift into virtual space, and thinking about how not only are we going to create an experience for the viewer that provides that, hopefully, both that connection to this community among community members and among people outside the community, but also disrupt their assumptions, right? So we can celebrate, but also sort of think critically about what's happening in the community and the history of the community. And we cast members of the community alongside professional actors in the piece. We had no idea whether anyone would come to a virtual audition for this thing, and then how on earth to do a community engaged project online with, we're never actually in the same room with people. And amazing amount of people showed up. We wound up having over 40 people in the play. And I live in Highland Park. I've been in Highland Park for a number of years, and I'm literally working with people that live 2-3 blocks from me that I've never met in real life, right? But there they are. We're in this neighborhood, and how to kind of provide the disruption in their lives so they can sort of open into making something, to stepping outside of themselves a little bit, taking those kind of risks, in this space was a really interesting challenge. What amazed me was how committed and how vulnerable people were willing to be on screen, right? And it really created this sort of opportunity for tremendous vulnerability among community members. It was almost a little shocking to me, and it kind of pushed the professional actors into a different place, right? Because the community members were so sort of available to each other, and they bonded tremendously with each other, and then that then translated for the audiences, at least from the response, to people really feeling like trying to understand it, but they're like, this really feels like theater, and I'm not really quite sure why. And I think it is because of the degree of vulnerability that the performers were bringing was disruptive of this sort of careful space, right? And that opportunity exists for us in ways that I think are still exciting, even when we're separated in boxes.
I so champion that, Michael. That's really beautiful, and I understand that. I understand the increased vulnerability, right, that this medium provides. Also, it's increased safety. I mean, there are some communities, right? I mean, I know that's what you were saying. I'm just offering. Yeah, there's some communities that are way more safe in this medium. They're not going to a theater, not because it's so unsafe, but it's not in their bones, or it's not their place. And I am thrilled to think, I mean, the amount of Middle Eastern women I've connected with that want to communicate this way, that want to watch something this way, that want to show grandma this thing that you really would only watch in a back room with the door closed, honestly, right? Like it's too secret, it's too vulnerable, right? And that we have to also think, when we think about coming back to the theater, that the people that are craving that sacred space and that communal space are people that mostly felt comfortable coming to begin with. And now the globe is ours, right? I mean, I imagine, Michael, when you're talking about the community you're working with, they're also saying they invited people that lived countries away, right? I mean, for me, my big experience was having one of my a Nigerian actress that had done a play of mine revisited it 5 years later online with her new baby in her arms, because that's what she could do. And she had her family watching who had never seen a play before in their lives. And I mean, that to me, there is nothing you can compare to that, to what the potential is.
Yeah, disruption in a civic space is like such a one great answer to what we're trying to get around here, what theater's for. And Michael, I mean, opening up and, you know, being close to all these other community members, and then having this vulnerability that fosters totally different, you know, way of thinking and just questions that come up in your mind, and just ways of seeing other people, perspectives opening up, is also just obviously a huge power. There's such a power with theater to point all those ingredients towards, you know, revealing alternate angles. So I'd love to also touch on what, you know, how theater is valuable now in times that are as turbulent as right now, when history making things are happening like on a daily basis. Why do you think when there's so much, if you want to use the word disruption in a different way, there's so much disruption already from the world, why do we need to keep curiosity alive and that vulnerability alive? Why do we need theater and experiences to exist once we are, you know, able to safely gather sometime in the future?
I think that, like, so earlier I talked about sort of the exchange of energy. I think there's also another exchange that's really important, and that's an exchange of ideas. And I think that it's always been important, but, you know, now more than ever, that ideas be exchanged, that we're constantly keeping our, not just our empathy, but not just our feelings, but like our mind sharp, like our intellect, our argumentation, our debates. We need, like, I feel like it's important that we be able to have an institution that promotes, you know, multiple points of view and pluralism, and like, and like force us out of like sort of rigid, you know, ways of thinking, and like understanding what life is for other people, and for ourselves. I think it's also a way that artists are also, I think, in theater, need to challenge themselves. And I think that, like, just the institution of theater is like a unique space to incubate that exchange of ideas, debate, and challenge intellectually.
Yeah, I mean, I could not agree more with what Michael said, and you know, creating a space for, and a safe space, like you said, Heather. I mean, like our job is to make this, like, to move forward into the next, you know, moment, and not sort of try to move backward into it or go back to something, and move forward into a space where we've created new access through this digital medium, and how to make the physical spaces safe for the people who feel safe on this digital medium. I mean, you know, when we did that show, Heather, you know, there was, you know, my son and some other people I talked to, you know, who are struggling with online school and complaining about it endlessly, although my son complains endlessly about school regardless, it is what's normed for me, right? And so when I was working with some of the young people who were in the show, a couple of them saying, oh, I prefer school on Zoom because I'm not being tortured. I'm not being harassed. I'm not being bullied. And intellectually, I sort of knew that, but to hear it from somebody, you know, is so moving. So how do we then make our spaces and create access and sort of remove barriers, really, to our spaces as we move forward, so that more people feel safe and welcome in the spaces. And we have to be really careful to understand that like theater is not value positive. It's value neutral and can be negative. I mean, quite frankly, you want to talk about the power of theater and that violent piece of theater that fascist supremacists perpetrated in a disrupted civic space a few days ago, which was never going to achieve any goal of changing the result of the election, was political theater, right? At its worst, you know, fascists are really good at that, right? And so how we create a field, a national field that is an antidote for that kind of theater, that is not trying to perpetuate the big lie, but actually perpetuate critical thinking and plurality of point of view and respect is really our opportunity. It's a wonderful opportunity, but it's also our job, because if we start to kind of be like relax into what we're doing, we've failed.
So can I just jump on that real quick? So like so I agree with you. I totally agree with you. But I also think that like if I think of what happened at the Capitol as theater, go with me on this, I think there's a way in which there's other pieces of theater that can be in response to it. Totally. And so for me, that actually does make that theater really valuable and important, because it's without it, I might not be able to sharpen my ideas beyond what I believe and feel and think as sort of in my little normie, you know, liberal box that I maybe live in, because I've never seen a bad show that I hated enough to want to pick up my pen and write something in response to it. So, which is not to say, I mean, obviously that was like a violent act, and I'm not saying like, oh, we need more of those things so that we all can like think more deeply about like the world we live in or the country we live in, but that like, I do think that like, there's also there's the possibility of an event like that happening, and the things that we learn from it can create great things, but there's also the possibility of the wrong lessons being learned from it, and we create really bad things, which is how I sort of think about, you know, this question of whether there will be a new domestic war on terror that comes out of our government as a result of this. And you know what I mean? So like but again, like I feel like in theater, I think like theater is a place to actually think about some of those kinds of ideas. And it's not always going to be comfortable, because we might all go, oh my God, what happened to the Capitol was so terrible. And yet I do think that there's like quite a lot of like, if you really dig to the bottom of lessons to be learned or ideas to be debated about what that was about, who was responsible, what do you call the people who were responsible, what does it mean to call someone a terrorist, what's the history of this word, like I just think there's a lot of grist for the mill out of that. And I actually hope that the theater, that practitioners of the theater dig deep down to the bottom of their soul to like figure out the complications of what that event was about, and like what are all the sides of it, and like what does it add up to, and what do we want moving forward.
Thank you for all of that. I mean, and thinking of theater as you know, possible provocation, and in considering safety in theater, there's some questions that are coming in, and I wanted to make some time for that, since I feel like we could got this for days on end. But we'd love to give some time to some of the great questions that are coming in. We won't be able to get to all of them, but I want to highlight a couple. So one question that came in is, to whom does theater belong? I mean, the process, the play, and the viewing experience. And I feel like we were just sort of talking about some of this, but I'm curious if that question itself sparks anything that you'd all like to contribute. So again, the question is, to whom does theater belong? I mean, the process, the play, and the viewing experience.
I just like to say that the thing that most excites me about this moment is the globalization and the equalization that this virtual theater moment is having. And I know it's not where artists collectively want to stay, but it answers to me a lot more about to whom it belongs. Because I've never been content with the ticket price or the theater goer or getting my community to the theater alongside the other communities. It's always been hugely frustrating, and I'm suddenly freed, right? I feel suddenly like the things I was trying to make are suddenly makeable because they can happen all over the world simultaneously at once, with the threads being apparent to all of us. So I know that's not a direct answer to the question, but it is my excitement about that question. Is that there? I think some artists will hugely crave getting back in the room, and I agree it can be a very beautiful room. But there are some of us that are imagining a global stories and global outreach in a way that we never could before.
Yeah, and I think I would say, piggybacking on both what sort of Heather said and what Michael said, I think that theater is for whoever wants to be there. And I think underlining the word want for me is really vital, because I feel like a lot of times there's a lot of conversations about like getting all this community or that community or this person in the room as though they have no choice about whether they even want to see this play or this musical or whatever. It's like, no, this is a play about Black blah 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 blah. You have to see it. I mean, we do that. We do our own little marketing ourselves. Like, we might be excited about something and want someone to see it, but like institutionally, like there might be people who don't want to see it. And so like what I do find exciting about the digital stuff, even though I am like super old school and like I hate it, but that's just me, just like what Michael was saying earlier, is that like his son loves digital school. My 15-year-old niece hates it. Like, she hates it so much. And I think that's a plurality. Like, and so like a theater can be something where it can exist in many forms and everyone can consume it however they want to. Like, if they want to never leave their house and watch theater on the screen, it would be great if they could do that. And then if some people want to go be in a room, they can go do that. And all of those things can like still be a mirror or a window and share ideas and do whatever it does and touch people however it touches them, or challenge them however it challenges them. If we can expand the reach of it, but also still let people decide for themselves what they want, to me, that would be the most ideal scenario. And I hope that the theater world moves toward that direction without trying to like push one way or the other, that like both ways are valid, or even a third way,
Yeah. I feel like we could talk about that for a while, but I want to get into more questions here. Another one that came in is, does the panel have thoughts on how theater has impacted American civic life? How have our choices as a field and as individual artists contributed to constructing the moment we're in right now?
Ooh, that's good.
Yeah.
So I'll respond to that by saying, this is in my view, the American theater exists in culture, and broadly speaking, it sort of lives in a, I guess, center left kind of slice of the pie. And as a result of that, it may be again, in my view, only tends to reach a narrow ideological or cultural group, broadly speaking. And perhaps as a result of that, over many, many years of that being true, whether, the players change or things gotten more diverse or whatever you want to call that, that it might have, perhaps it's contributed to a really divided sense of like what it's contributed to like a divided sense of story, for lack, I think that's the best way I could describe it. And so maybe, if we're able to sort of broaden the cultural reach and expression, mode of expression, thoughts, ideas, and so on and so forth, that it can be helpful to expanding beyond the moment that we're in right now. But that's just, that's a thought I've been having for many months of like the sort of lack of ideological diversity in the theater world in a general sense, and whether that, and I think that's also true of like the entertainment, Hollywood, all the cultural centers, that like that there may be, we might have like been a little myopic to a lot of other people, in addition to lots of other factors that contributed to this moment.
Mm-hmm.
I think I would piggyback but rephrase a bit, in that for me, what Michael was talking about felt very much like commercial theater. And if I were to take Liz Lerman's approach, it's the vertical sense of attainment and success rather than the horizontal. And I think many of us work in a more horizontal capacity. I mean, I would say that's not true when I'm working with kids in Dearborn or with Middle Eastern women in Queens or doing theater in Iraq or Abu Dhabi or the places that I work. So it feels like that's true if I reflect only on my New York City regional theater. What's my experience there? What's the American theater in that? But that's not the American theater. That's something maybe about some, right? So I think that I would say, I also think that the responsibility is to build off what artists always have been, and we're canaries in the coal mine. We've been saying the things and saying the things and saying the truth, right? All of us on this Zoom, I'm looking at you, right? We've all been saying it, and we know the other people who've been saying it. And some of us can get a commercial outlet and some of us can't, or some of it goes this way or some of it goes that way, but we're saying it. And I think that the canaries will serve the moment always, somehow, eventually, in big ways, in small ways, in communal ways, in epic ways, in Broadway ways. Like it will happen, and the institution itself will come round. But I think that the artists I know have been saying it.
I guess, like, if I can be a little bit clearer about what I was saying, is that, like, if I'm just reading this question right about constructing the moment we're in right now, I am talking very broadly. I'm talking very specifically about like New York regional, like off-Broadway, Broadway. That is what I'm talking about, like, which is not to discount any of the work that anyone is doing in communities or any at all. But like, to me, it does seem clear that like those cultural centers have the most, they're afforded the most resources that then get the most eyeballs and attention and capitalist sort of underpinnings and all the things that I think end up impacting the sort of culture that I was responding to, that I think might be a little too narrow, and why I'm sort of, in the midst of all these various reckonings that we're having, in the theater, or supposedly, I'm one thing I hope for is maybe a little bit more ideological diversity within the stories that are told, within the points of view that these stories come from, like, which is not, again, is not necessarily comfortable, because then it means that like maybe you like as artists, as theater makers, we have to like actually deal with other people who like really see the world in a different way than we do. But I don't know, like I think it's gonna be an ongoing problem / discussion / experiment to see if that's even possible. But that's just sort of how I feel about when I think about theater's role or in this moment, in the moment right now.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of go back to, like, I feel like what you were initially saying, Michael, harkens back to the first question of who is theater for. Something that I've been thinking about a lot is how these, though theater aspires to be a civic space, most, like the buildings that house the theaters are not giving people, the cues that make everyone feel like this is their space and that they can go there. Like, unless you have for so many cultural spaces, they're designed in such a way that if you don't have a ticket, to go to the Met, you have no reason to walk across that plaza, or to enter that space. And so I feel like the accessibility of our cultural spaces is something that I've been thinking about a lot. And yeah, I think to what you were saying, Michael, I mean, it makes me think a little bit about, in terms of perhaps the divisiveness that you were speaking about, of like the class and ideological swath that this kind of perhaps more commercial or more visible sector of theater occupies. It just sort of makes me think a little bit about my parents. So my parents were immigrants to this country, from Taiwan, and they didn't know anything about theater. And like when I was growing up, like having never gone to see theater, suddenly my mother decided that every year we were going to go see a Broadway show or an opera. Didn't really matter which one, but like that the ritual of going at Christmas time to see the theater, like for her, that was like, we've arrived at the, American bourgeoisie, like we've assimilated, like that was something that they had to strive for. And like, that's sort of what your comments made me think of a little bit.
Yeah, and I also would just add, like, so I've told some people this story over time, but like, I have 2 neighbors who live in my apartment who are not, they don't fit the profile of what you would normally think of as a Trump supporter, but they did nevertheless voted for Donald Trump both times. And I began a friendship with them. It's a gay couple, interracial gay couple. And I began a friendship with them 4 years ago. And like what I found was having many, what started off as arguments, then turned into like conversations, then turned into like a friendship. And like I actually spent Thanksgiving with them, and they know where I stand on a wide range of issues, and I know where they stand. And also like their particular Trump support is very different from the stereotypical Trump support. But like they came to see my show and they loved it. And like, but like my friendship with them just really opened my eyes to in ways that I just was not seen prior to Trump being elected the first time, that there are a lot of people with like really gnarly points of view that are just not easily categorizable. That's not a word, but, and I found the more I talked to them, I was grateful to constantly have that tension in our beliefs, that and that it actually forced me to then look even deeper into the world beyond what I ever had looked into. And I feel like doing that has only helped me as an artist try to like become sharper and like think more compassionately about lots of people who I would have just 4 years ago written off completely. And so I endeavor to create theater that makes all these people feel welcome. Not like it has nothing to do with like catering to a point of view, because I'm always going to come from my point of view. But like, there was nothing in my show to like signal to them, you don't belong here. And like, and yet they felt challenged by some of what was in the show, but they also were like into that. And so, you know, I feel like there's an opportunity in theater to really lean into that kind of thing. Again, not without sacrificing anybody's integrity, but like with a deep understanding that there's like a lot of people out there. And there might be value that they can find in what you create, even if they are on somewhere else on the ideological spectrum. And there might be things that we, as much as we might be afraid of it, can learn from them.
Thanks, Michael. We need to wrap up, but I do want to pose one last question to you all that's connected to what you're talking about. I think, you know, theater can seem so elitist, professional theater, mainstream theater. Mimi, yes, the whole reason I'm in theater is because my parents wanted the like American dream experience of bringing their kids to a Broadway musical, and then I just fell in love with it and they lost me to it. But you know, it really anyone could create theater. It's the systems that can become bloated, but anyone can create something, gather people. You know, Anne Washburn's Mr. Burns is a play that was at Playwrights Horizons and that investigated that. And I think about that all the time, just how the scale and tone and approach can change, but theater will survive. But there are barriers for sure in how theater exists in society right now. And many of those are, you know, keeping out the deeper conversations, like what you were talking about stumbling into, Michael, with your neighbors. That's actually part of why we're doing this new visual art series and wanting our theater to become a porous space, as Adam beautifully says, where you engage with art and, you know, you see shows, you talk about them, you exchange energy in unexpected ways. So that leads me to another question that I think is a really important question, especially in, you know, the late capital world we're in, which is how can we work towards tearing down economic barriers in theater? I'm curious what you all. What would you like to see in the theater world that moves towards tearing those down?
Government intervention.
So true.
Nationalized theater. I don't know. I always come back to that. It always seemed like if we could get that kind of funding, that it would make theater be more essential to everyone. And like, but I know that it's complicated, like it always is, but that's like always my answer.
I would like the American theater that Michael's talking about to value different ways of producing. I build most of my theater in community, and then I take those plays to communities with opposing points of view and really work on the kind of dialogue he was talking about having with his neighbor, but I work with it in audience. And I've found that the establishment American theater finds that very threatening and doesn't know how to support processes like that, and gets very, their feathers ruffled by that kind of multiplicity of the way things are created. And I think that it would bring community. It would help a lot more crossover community come into the theater. But I don't have an answer. I don't have any inspiration to the economic model, because I think it's, I mean, as one of the more older people in this room. Like the economic model like stumps me. I can't believe I'm this age and I still can't figure it out, right? I don't know how it'll survive.
I mean, I'm not sure that the former economic model, at least in some ways, is going to survive or should survive, honestly, and kind of hopefully it doesn't. But at least in some ways, I certainly like artists to make a living. I mean, honestly, I think you remove barriers by removing barriers. I mean, the culture needs to change. I mean, boards of directors of not-for-profits don't own the theaters. I'm going to curse. I'm going to try not to curse, but they don't own the theaters, right? They don't, and so we have to stop making theater about a kind of social prestige and make it about the work. And that's the field can do it by doing it. You know what I mean? I mean, the regional theater abdicated to a sort of a New York centric thing. It's not what the regional theater was for ever at all. And there was a great abdication that happened that has contributed to what Michael talks about in terms of the failure of the field as field. I mean, there's this tremendous vital community arts network that has been very successful at being a big part of being a forum for and a part of what we might think of as the resistance to that, the grassroots resistance to that. But as a field, as an economic field, you know, it's part of the liberal fail, right? And that's how we've contributed to the present moment as a field, as an economic field, and not-for-profit feeding into the commercial theater, totally subsidized, totally commodified. Stop. I mean, you know what I mean? Broadway's going to be Broadway, you know, but like not-for-profits are supposed to exist for the profit. They're not actually supposed to exist to channel big plays and to be semi-commercial houses that funnel plays into the commercial theater. That's not what they're for. Broadway should be paying for that and doing their development. And if they're going to be not-for-profits, the not-for-profit model sucks, but if they're going to be, they should actually be serving the public. And people should call the theater on them. People should call the field on them. Theater shouldn't get tax breaks if they're not doing that. Change it.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks to everyone. We're already over an hour, and I want to respect everyone's time. So I just want to thank you for so much for, you know, getting at this question with me about what theater's role is. It's a big question to, you know, and like asking you all, like having this conversation about the reason our community exists, especially in the current state of the world, is a big ask. So thank you, Michael, Mimi, Heather, Michael. And thanks to everyone who tuned in and for all of your incredible questions. I wish we could have gotten to more of them. There's some really great stuff there. I feel like we could have talked about this for a while. We planned this conversation about theater's role in a culture to help frame our new public art initiative. We're so excited to launch this series with a new staggering piece from artist Jilly Ballistic, who is self-described as New York City's most well-known unknown street and subway artist. And you could see that on the front of our building on 42nd Street this Tuesday through the end of February. And if you want to learn more about Jilly's work and the intersection of public art, performance, and activism, which is, you know, what we were all touching on today, please come back for our second Lighthouse talk, Public Art, Public Space, which is happening 1 week from now, same time, same place. It'll be a conversation between Jilly Ballistic and multidisciplinary artist Joy Episala, artist, writer, and activist Avram Finkelstein, and our very own artistic director of Playwright Horizons, Adam Greenfield. So please join then, and you can sign up on our website. And you know, these are tough times, but if you're able to help keep all of this curiosity and inquiry going, and these incredible artists that we're, you know, working with and bringing on for these conversations, you can text Lighthouse PH to 44321 or visit phnyc.org/donate to give. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and take good care. Bye.